But for us today, it matters because it mattered to Jesus. And it also matters because ultimately heaven is our eternal home. As I began to pray about and think about this, I just began to reflect on my life. And maybe your life responds just a bit to my life. It kind of corresponds a bit to my life. As I began to think about what were some serious seasons in my life when I really began to wonder, what was heaven like? When I began to really think, okay, are there streets of gold? Are there pearly gates? What will my mansion look like, right? Anybody want to know that? Do I get any say in what my home will look like? And I thought back, interestingly enough, on the seasons in my life when I thought about heaven the most, and they always came after a crisis. And it's probably the same way with you. It's easy when things are going in our life or going well in our life and things are looking good in our life for us to forget about our eternal home. But as I thought back in my life, I was also now, didn't realize it then, I was reminded of what Solomon said. In Ecclesiastes, Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, as he neared the end of his life and he looked back on his life with regret, he said, he has found on this earth that we learn more in the house of pain than we do in the house of rejoicing. Seems kind of odd. Here's what he was saying is, we often learn more about our own lives sitting at a funeral than we do at a birthday party. Why is that? He was saying because we have a tendency to reflect on the most important things in life. Because we know one day that will be our funeral. I don't know if you've done the statistics lately, but about 1 out of every one of us will die. It's way up there. It's way up there. And it's easy for us to get caught up in television shows and how much money we have in our bank accounts and sports and things that really matter. But it's oftentimes those seasons in our lives of great loss or loss of a loved one or contemplation of our own health that really causes us to think about the deep things in life. And I went back and I wrote down in my life the very first time I really remember thinking, what is heaven like? And I was a young child, and I remember being at my grandparents' house when my grandfather, who had been sick, actually died. I can remember sitting there and hearing my grandmother crying in the room and my father trying to console her and her calling out for my grandfather, and then the funeral that was to follow. And I was young, but I remember that. Not long after that, one of my cousins who I was there with, just a little older than me, drowned in Galveston. And I remember sitting at the funeral thinking, what is heaven like? It wasn't but a little over a year after that his sister, as an older teenager, was diagnosed with breast cancer. And she passed away very quickly after that. And I remember clearly thinking about heaven. I remember being a junior at Baylor and my father passing away. And for a long season, thinking about heaven. I can remember right before Jeana and I started dating, right after I surrendered the ministry, her father, who had been in my life all my life, her father died of a heart attack. And I remember thinking about heaven. I remember not long after Jeana and I were married that her mother died of cancer. And I can clearly remember by that time I was pastoring what was Old Fairview. And I can remember being at the service and thinking about heaven and the confidence that she had as she was taking her last breaths on here, that her last breath here would immediately precede her first breath in heaven. I remember to this day, the next Sunday, when I walked back into the worship service and I'm standing up there to preach, and that song was played after her mom had passed away, and having tears in my eyes, getting ready to go preach because I was thinking about heaven. I remember very clearly when we as a family endured 2 miscarriages. One in the very late stages, a son that we had named after my father. And I remember thinking that our children were in heaven. Then my brother took his life a few years ago, and I remember clearly thinking about heaven. And so heaven matters. It matters because that is where our Savior is. But it matters more so because that's where He wants every one of us to be headed.